So I recently did a video talking about how The Conjuring ruined modern horror, but in general my point was more about James Wan himself. With Wan being the kind of genius that he is, he has consistently brought to the world new concepts and revolutionary films in horror that shape the genre for years to come. Like his first in Saw, and then Body Gore became huge in horror, or then when he came back and did The Conjuring and Insidious, and then Haunting and Conjuring style movies became huge. And all of these films spawned big franchises afterwards, all three of which had installments just this year. But in 2021, James Wan returned to horror to release a movie that hasn't had quite the same legacy. A very divisive and heavily debated film. And that's Malignant. To this day, people cannot decide on whether this film is great or tripe. I lean on the side of brilliant. I think one of the central issues people have with this film is the tone. I often hear people complain about the corny directing choices, the simplistic story beats, the rigid dialogue, and it makes the tone feel goofy and unintentionally funny, but here's where I stand. I think this movie is purposefully camp. I think it knows exactly what it's doing with the tone, and I think there's an overarching reason for it. Because there's a million influences in this thing, Suspiria to one's own films to most notably for this point, Sam Raimi films like The Evil Dead and such. Not so much in concept but in directing style. Raimi is very camp, it's inherently his style, so when he does it, it's expected, people get it. Unless it's a Marvel movie and people completely misunderstand that, but in general, people expect that from Raimi. However, people do not expect that from James Wan. He's usually a pretty cut and dry director, not many huge and flashy tricks, no hyper-specific style. Distinct but not super identifiable like Raimi's is, so when one is using Raimi as a point of influence, I think that campy style bleeds in and is fully intentional, but because people don't expect that from one or basically anyone in the 21st century, it gets lost in the mix and comes off as unintentional and bad. I think the best example of this influence is in the intro with the dolly zooms, the tracking shots, the funny line delivery, and it's very much appreciated from a Raimi fan, but to someone not so accustomed with that campy style, I can understand how this comes across as terrible or even amateur. But speaking of this intro, I think it's so stellar because it perfectly sets up the entire movie, which sounds like an obvious thing for an intro to do, but most films don't actually do this that well. This has a mystery presented. It tells you how goofy the film is going to be, its backstory to the villain, and we don't even truly know it. It sells you on a question that it trickles fragments of an answer to you the whole time, and more than anything, the film is balancing between being supernatural and being sci-fi, which the entire film is doing. See, another thing people love to point out is that the film can't truly decide on what it wants to be, whether that be a supernatural horror, a slasher, a sci-fi horror, a psychological horror, a creature feature. And though plenty of people think that's a bad thing, I think it's again a purposeful choice that is also executed perfectly. Because I think the point of all these blended subgenres is one, demonstrating how similar they all actually are and how much horror as a whole is just one big family that may have individual subgenres with unique traits and tropes. They're all still related and very much based in the same DNA. Like sci-fi and creature features / monster movies so often have crossover or less obvious connections like slashers and supernatural horrors. Because how many times have you seen a slasher film and the killer, whether it be Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or whoever, seemingly teleports from one location to another and you sit there thinking how they got there so quickly, or they just show up in seemingly impossible ways, almost like they have superpowers. That is straight up supernatural abilities, and I think one goes absolute galaxy brain when weaving these together. He perfectly finds the similarity points in all of these types of horror and connects them effortlessly. And this is all without talking about the actual film, the plot points and story, and how it executes these ideas. Because the film is campy for sure, but it also demonstrates incredible competence in tension building, which one has shown to be a master of in his previous movies. From the beginning sequence to the chilling opening credits, to this scene of domestic abuse, to this sequence of a sort of haunting and attack, one keeps the plot moving with a constant tension and suspense that just simply evolves into different states and scenarios, all while setting up a perfectly simple and effective protagonist in Madison. From the surface, she's an easily identifiable victim and pending heroine. She's a pregnant woman in an abusive relationship who loses her baby among losing 3 prior to miscarriages and is now seemingly being haunted by a killer which she has some sort of psychic connection with. But I love how quickly we go from being able to empathize with her, sympathize even, to suspecting her. As the crumbs of this weirdly 2000s slasher mystery unfolds, the film kind of turns you on this seemingly perfectly innocent protagonist. But in an interesting way, they don't just make her a suspect, they make her an unknown suspect, someone with reasonable doubt. So though you think that she might be the problem, you can also root for her at the same time. They tell you that this killer has been historically referred to as Madison's imaginary friend, Gabriel. And then of course the film travels from this suspicion to the eventual reveal, which is in my opinion genuinely insane but in the greatest possible way. We find out that this threat, this creature and serial killer Gabriel is actually a part of Madison. They were conjoined twins, but Gabriel existed in a sort of parasitic way, leeching off Madison's young body to grow stronger and take over. During this reveal, they give you some of the craziest creature design straight out of a Cronenberg picture, and eventually they make the decision to remove Gabriel from Madison as he's essentially draining her life force to become stronger. An actual crazy premise, and though extremely goofy, blends into the campiness extremely well. But yes, the big reveal is that Gabriel was never removed, not fully. He was pressed into her skull to remain dormant, which he was until Madison's husband bashed her against a wall and reawoke him. We also find out that Gabriel was the reason behind her previous miscarriages. He was terminating the pregnancies to grow stronger, waiting for an eventual return. Then in one of the sickest scenes I've ever seen, where Gabriel emerges from her head in an incredible display of prosthetics and practical creature design and murders an entire holding cell of people. And the choreography of this breakout is genuinely impressive, and there's a certain level of upgrade in this sequence. The film turns up to 11 and takes on a whole other level of gore that earns its R rating. Also, Zoe Bell is always a W. We go into our final moments where Gabriel is about to enact his revenge, and it turns out that Madison has manifested Gabriel's powers and pulled some kind of Jedi mind trick on him and is now capable of using the Force to trick him and make herself more powerful than previous. It concludes very naturally and satisfactory for such a bizarre concept. And though overall the film goes absolutely nuts in the third act, or essentially its whole second half, I think the progression is steady and everything is earned. The film, though presenting as simplistic and derivative, is incredibly complex as it interlaces all of these concepts and ideas, subgenres and narratives. A million twists and turns and reveals get layered constantly, and the film never feels like it's taken on too much. It's still extremely streamlined, there's no fat, every setup gets payoff, every question gets answered, every detail has purpose. Like in the beginning when the then unknown killer murders the husband and doesn't kill Madison or the tour guide, you may ask why. Because that happens a lot in horror where somebody dies but another person gets spared, and it's never really answered why, it just seems kind of out of character. But here the film tells you there is actually a reason. When the husband bashes Madison's head against the wall, it is a seemingly meaningless act of violence, but it's actually the most pivotal moment in the whole script. The blood on the pillow every night seems like a minor detail, remnants of a past injury, but it's in fact a clue to Gabriel's existence and antics. The tapes from Madison's youth, when she was then Emily, and experiments fill in the blanks of the intro and even the opening credits, which at first just seem like B-roll footage. And I've been thinking about this film in relation to the other Wan films that have inspired years worth of rip-offs and inspired works. Why didn't this one do the same? Because again, the film is parading as simplistic, but is ultimately doing so much more than you could possibly untangle. It also has multiple interpretations and allegories and metaphors operating at once, like the film being representative of pregnancy or postpartum depression, miscarriages, cancer itself, or a wealth of mental illnesses like bipolar, bipolar or BPD or of course DID, and horror a lot of the time is exactly about this, taking some kind of real world horror or situation and expressing it through the medium of film in an incredibly artistic way and allowing the audience to sort of piece that together and find their own meaning in the work. These interpretations, along with the fun mystery, the campy nature, the great creature design, the effortless flow of information, the weaving of subgenres, the ever-changing narrative, the score that goes ridiculously hard, and everything else come together to make this film so endlessly rewatchable. I find new details and new things to love every single watch, and it only gets better every time. I'm interested to see how this film's legacy will grow, whether the general audience will ever find a common ground on it, or whether it will continue being incredibly divisive. Either way, let me know what you think of Malignant. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you impartial? I want to know. And whether it's a heavily debated James Wan masterpiece or not. As always, keep watching movies.